So I absolutely love studying and teaching the pre-Socratic philosophers, the first so-called philosophers in the Western tradition. They're a key to understanding the modern mind. So the purpose of this video is to get you interested in the pre-Socratic so that you watch my longer video where I go into more depth, right? I'll explain how the pre-Socratics set up the rules for the reductionist game that modern scientists are still playing, and how the problems arising in modern physics and mathematics, for example, were anticipated long ago by the pre-Socratics. To truly understand your mind and the modern mind, and to question modern dogma, you must return to the roots, the pre-Socratics. You'll find so many interesting distinctions, like the distinction between being itself versus the many particular beings. That's Parmenides. You'll find the paradoxical nature of time and space discussed. You'll find this idea that there's unity and diversity, and that maybe our reason, our little brains really can understand the nature of the cosmos, right? Is reality infinitely divisible in mind only? There's just so many interesting ideas. So studying the pre-Socratics is like going underground and studying the roots of a tree that's been growing for 2,500 years. Studying them will help you better understand the history of ideas and why modern philosophy has developed as it has. You'll find the roots for all modern movements in the pre-Socratics, whether it be skepticism, postmodernism, scientism, theistic arguments, and you'll come to better understand them by studying the pre-Socratics. So the first pre-Socratic, 585 BC, is Thales. Thales argued that all of ultimate reality is reducible to water. So in the longer video, I'll explore his arguments in more depth. For now, the importance of Thales' thinking is not the content, but the form. He was trying to reduce all types of things to one type of thing. He started the reductionist game we are still playing. Right? Instead of water, you might think everything's reducible to atoms, right? Or quarks, or energy, or something. Right? But he started that game. He was seeking more natural and rationalistic explanations. He appealed to water instead of Zeus. Again, he started a game that intellectuals, scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians still play. Now, we know that water is not the one, the arch, the ultimate origin of all things, since water is reducible to oxygen and hydrogen. But the form of Thales' thinking is still with us. It's like the pre-Socratics set up the game, the game of chess, and we've been playing it for 2,500 years. So Anaximander is the next pre-Socratic, and he argued that the one could not be water because water cannot become its opposite, fire, and still be water. Because whatever the one is, it causes and is in everything else. But if water is in fire, it would quench it, right? So it can't become incompatible forms. It can't be water. The one, or apeiron, cannot be water because it cannot give rise to its opposite fire. Also the one, the apeiron, Anaximander called it the apeiron, it cannot be fire because it cannot give rise to its opposite water. The one, apeiron, cannot be positive, you could argue, because it cannot give rise and be in its opposite, negative. Right? The one, the apeiron, cannot be triangular because it cannot become a circle and still be a triangle. Perhaps. The one, the apeiron, cannot be yin, you could say, because it cannot both cause and be in yang. Right? So in short, whatever the one is, it cannot be any definite form because it would be impossible for it to keep that form and become an incompatible form. The one, the arch, the apeiron, the ultimate stuff must be indefinite, infinite, boundless. We don't sense it. We must use our reason to know it's there. So you see this reason-sense dichotomy arising. Now there's much more that's fascinating about Anaximander. You can see my longer video for more. Let's go to Anaximenes. Anaximenes disagreed with the previous two thinkers. Now Anaximenes agreed that the one could not be water because that's too definite, but he did not think it could be the indefinite apeiron of Anaximander, right? Because that's too indefinite. It's like it has no limits, and so it's like nothing at all. Has no form, it's nothing at all. So it must be something in between, and he thought it was invisible physical air particles. And Anaximenes thought everything was composed of tiny air particles, kind of like a conception of atoms, right? And for reasons, he thought that it was composed of these for reasons similar to why we believe dark matter exists today. And the reason we believe dark matter exists is because we see the effect it has on universes and planets, on things that we can see. So Anaximenes, for example, was observing how the water thief works. And a water thief is like a little bucket, a watering bucket. And when you fill it with water, it has little holes in the bottom, the water comes out. But if you put your thumb on the nozzle, the water doesn't come out. When you lift your thumb, the water rushes out. So Anaximenes reasoned that there must be these little physical, invisible air particles when you lift your thumb that rush into the water thief, the water bucket, and they push the water down and cause it to come out. So based on these empirical physical observations, he inferred the existence of the invisible air floating around that we can't see but has the effect on things that we can see. It's invisible to the eye, but it has physical form. So he discovered the invisible in a way. He gave us good reasons for believing that. Now, he's also credited for discovering how changes in quantity lead to changes in quality. So when the air particles are bunched together, they're really dense, a solid arises. And when they're spread apart, a gas arises. So a change in the quantity of air particles can change a thing from a gas to a solid or vice versa. Very modern ideas, right? Now, there's so much more to learn about Anaximenes. Very interesting guy. Okay. But basically, he disagreed with the previous two thinkers and said that the one stuff from which everything arises is a plurality of things. It's one kind of thing, air particles. All right, let's look at the next guy, Xenophanes. So Xenophanes was a poet, and he's somebody who's known for giving natural explanations for natural phenomena like rainbows. For example, rainbows are caused by the interaction of light and watery clouds, not by Zeus or something supernatural, right? So we see here the pre-Socratic theme of trying to give more natural explanations instead of mythological and supernatural stories. We also see the pre-Socratic theme of reductionism, of reducing everything to something simpler, in this case water and clouds and sunlight. We'll explore that in more detail later. Xenophanes is also famous for this quote: "If oxen and horses and lions had hands, they would draw figures of the gods that look like horses, and oxen would draw figures of the gods that look like oxen." So most interpreters say he was criticizing common forms of religion, common conceptions of God. Xenophanes here seems to be protesting the personification and anthropomorphizing of the one, which may or may not be God. So you can see the longer lecture for a more in-depth exploration of that. Right? There's, one question that arises here, and you may want to think about, whatever the one, the ultimate stuff of the universe is it conscious? Is it aware? Or is awareness just something that that brains have, right? And brains are just composed of atoms. Is there something that emerges from that, or is the one ultimate stuff conscious? Now, it's a very modern problem that actually, that's been arising recently with the hard problem of consciousness and stuff. And I think some of these pre-Socratic thinkers, as we'll see later, were onto this, and it was important. But that's for the longer video. Let's go to the next pre-Socratic. His name was Pythagoras. So Pythagoras is the next pre-Socratic. He began a religion, right? And Pythagoras, c squared equals a squared plus b squared. So what he said is numbers are the ultimate stuff from which the universe arises. And some modern scholars reduce his philosophy to the idea that we can use mathematics to discover the nature of reality, which is not very controversial. But this is a modern misunderstanding. The ideas of Pythagoras were much more interesting and mystical. He seems to have believed that everything really is numbers, right? The one, the arch from which everything comes, and which is in everything, is numbers. Numbers are not just symbols. They're real. Okay. For example, this table in front of me may be reducible to atoms. And atoms, we now know, are reducible to ever smaller particles, forces, and tendencies. In the Pythagorean view, the ultimate reduction eventually leads to numbers. And perhaps this is why current reductionist attempts in physics are getting closer and closer to nothing at all, because if numbers are the ultimate reality, they don't exist like tables, chairs, or arguably minds. You can see my video called Why Numbers Are More Real Than Atoms to introduce you to modern Platonists, Pythagorean, modern mathematical realists, people who still believe that numbers are the ultimate reality. Now, there's some confusion as to whether they perceive numbers as material or immaterial, and I'll explore that in a longer video. I'll try to give you some reasons for their view, by outlining the arguments of modern mathematical realists. And again, many geniuses today do indeed believe that numbers are real in a way that you may have never imagined. There's more to math than meets the eye. Reality is much stranger than any modern conception of it. And you don't have to smoke anything to believe that. You just got to read some of these PreSocratics. Okay. By the way, look at Flatland, look at the dimension lesson, we talked about the higher dimensions. I'll make some videos on that in the future as well. Let's go to the next PreSocratic, Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is difficult to understand. He spoke in paradoxes. And perhaps that was to indicate the idea that ultimate reality is itself paradoxical. Ultimate reality cannot be rationally grasped. It can only be pointed to. Heraclitus. So he reminds me of mystic poets, Zen Buddhists, and Nietzsche, because his riddles and paradoxes and aphorisms cause one to turn inward and experience reality directly instead of looking out at reality through lenses and trying to construct a theory and subsume everything under that theory. And by the way, Nietzsche had read some of Heraclitus and was inspired by that. So one Heraclitian quote is, "The way up and the way down is one and the same." Right? Think about going on the same road, up a hill or down a hill. So as we shall see in the longer video, Heraclitus associated the one with fire. So the one is not water, it's not the boundless stuff, it's not numbers, right? And it's not air particles, it's fire. But he only meant fire as a metaphor. Don't take it literally. Heraclitus really believed that there is no one. So in a way, he's the first anarchist because he believes the existence of an arch, right? There's no permanent physical stuff to hold on to. He says you cannot step into the same river twice. It's the same in name only. It's constantly flowing like reality. So he symbolized ultimate reality as fire because fire is more of a process than a thing. It contains and it consumes all opposites. And yet this fiery process is somehow ordered by some non-thing called the logos. The logos is so interesting. You can only grasp the logos with intuition or reason, not really your senses. And you can see the longer video for more. Parmenides and Zeno are the next two PreSocratics. And Parmenides is going to argue that being itself is the one, the arch, from which everything comes, not any particular being in small b, right? And his philosophy is a profound meditation on being itself, being with a big B. And it's mind-boggling and strange, okay? Now, along the way, Parmenides will attempt to prove that motion is impossible. That's an illusion. Motion is impossible. Being itself does not move, for there's nothing outside of being for it to move into. And he has so many clever arguments that we'll get into in a longer video. So interesting. And by the way, also very relevant to various religions when you talk about being itself versus all the particular beings, because the strongest conceptions of God conceive of God as being itself, not any particular being in space and time. But I digress. He had a student named Zeno, and Zeno presented many brilliant paradoxes that are still discussed today. Okay, here's one paradox. The tortoise is racing the hare. Suppose the tortoise gets a head start of 10 feet in a 100-foot race. By the time the hare covers that same 10 feet, the tortoise will have walked another foot. But by the time the hare hops that foot, the tortoise will have traveled another inch or two. And by the time the hare travels that inch or two, the tortoise will have walked some distance. So how can the hare ever catch the tortoise? So, you see, it's impossible to walk to the door. Motion is impossible. Right? Congratulations, you are enlightened. Now, I know you protest. Your senses tell you a different story. You experience yourself moving to the door, but reason says it's impossible. So there must be something wrong with reason. That's a crisis. Kind of like the double split experiment, maybe. Crisis. Right? Or there's something wrong with the assumptions that we have about time, space, and infinity, which we use in this argument. Or there's something wrong with our senses and our belief in movement. Noticing that space and time are infinitely divisible, 1/2 or 1/2 or 1/2 and so on, perhaps one could try to solve this paradox by saying space and time are infinitely divisible, but in reality they cannot be infinitely divided. The distinction is between mentally divisible and physically dividable. Space and time then are not composed of infinitely discrete units that we must cross to move to the door, or catch the hare, or run through the stadium, right? They just cannot actually be infinitely divided like that in concrete reality. So that's one strategy, but if you use that strategy to try to solve the paradox, it leads to new problems about the nature of time, which are addressed in Zeno's arrow paradox. So perhaps time and space really are illusions, or perhaps it's just the beliefs we have about them that are mistaken. Now, what might surprise you is that we do not have a solution to this problem even today, and I believe this is because we still do not understand time and space. You can research Zeno's paradox for more. Even though we now have calculus and practical solutions and, taking derivatives and limits and all that stuff, the conceptual problem Zeno outlines still remains. And if you don't trust me, check out Numberfield's YouTube video on Zeno's paradox, or look at the videos by Angela Hobbs on Zeno. There are some people who have claimed to solve it, but many intelligent mathematicians and physicists and philosophers say we haven't really solved the conceptual problem. So do your research and question this modern assumption that we now understand time, space, and can easily resolve these old paradoxes with calculus or some other pragmatic method. The conceptual problem remains, at least in my mind, and it's deep, baffling, and interesting. Now, before leaving, clever Zeno, a word about paradox. A paradox means against doxia, against common sense. So these paradoxes cause us to question what we take for granted. Reason seems to contradict the senses, and the first postulates of reason itself. Paradoxes often present a crisis, much like the crisis we find in modern physics, the strangeness of modern physics. It shows reality is not what it seems, or that we're terribly mistaken in some claim we believe, because that claim leads to something paradoxical, absurd, irrational. Right? In the modern world, we are facing the paradoxes of physics and consciousness, like the hard problem and so on, which may suggest the reductionist project that began with the PreSocratics cannot in principle be completed. Anti-reductionism is on the rise. Reason outlining its own limits is on the rise. Right? And so it's just very interesting and still very relevant. Parmenides and Zeno. So the last group of PreSocratics is called the Pluralists. The Pluralists believe that ultimate reality, the one, the arch, is composed of many tiny indestructible units. They're not one thing, but one type of thing. So Democritus is the first and most famous pluralist. He believed that reality is composed of indestructible and uncuttable atoms flying through the void, through empty space. So atom literally means uncuttable. The atoms are uncuttable, which means they cannot be further divided into smaller parts. Here's a quote from Democritus. By convention, things are sweet, but in reality, all are atoms in the void. So this table is not what it seems. It's just atoms in the void. The void is empty space for him. Now, in the longer video, I'll explain how Democritus tried to reconcile Parmenides and Heraclitus, and how modern his ideas are when you consider atoms and Planck constants and so on. And we'll also look at some criticisms. Now, the next PreSocratic is Empedocles. He's also a pluralist. He believes that we're composed of earth, air, fire, and water instead of atoms. But Empedocles believed these basic elements are ordered by a force called love and pulled apart by a force called strife. Seems like a personification, but maybe it's not. We have to think about this. What he's doing is he's struggling. So he's struggling to understand where the order, the apparent order of the universe comes from. Right? In our modern world, you might ask, where do these natural laws come from? Are they just descriptions of natural empirical events? Or is there something more to the natural laws that the scientists keep discovering, and mathematicians too? So if we think of evolution in a really loose sense, not biological, why can't natural laws evolve over time? What are they if they're not changing? So in the longer video, I'll explain how his ideas are still relevant and shape some of the deepest thoughts of modern thinkers. Also, Empedocles, he died in a very interesting way. You should look that up. So the story goes, he jumped into a volcano. Okay, the next thinker is Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras rejected the idea of 4 basic elements and the idea of atoms. Everything is composed of infinitely divisible seeds, he argued. Each seed is something like an element in today's chemistry. He wrote, in all things there's a portion of everything. So in carbon, the carbon seeds dominate. In trees, the tree seeds dominate. Kind of crude way of thinking of it. In water, the water seeds outnumber those other things. So he is a pluralist. All things are composed of smaller, indestructible things, and those indestructible things happen to be infinite in number. Now, one of his contributions is nous, or mind, the ordering principle of the seeds. This mind or nous is not physical, it's independent. It exists in itself like a necessary being. It organizes all the matter in the universe. So remember, Empedocles struggled to answer the question of where the order comes from with his love, strife stuff. And so did Democritus in various ways, mechanical ways. But Anaxagoras gives us an interesting answer. There is a mind, a nous, that organizes. And this mind seems to be non-physical. So it poses an interesting modern question, is consciousness, is awareness something that just comes from brains and brains just come from mechanical unconscious atoms? Or is consciousness, mind, something that's in ultimate reality too? That question has not been answered yet, in my opinion. Anaxagoras is on the side of those who feel that this universe and all in it could not have arisen by accident. A non-physical mind orders, and these roots in Anaxagoras lead to many modern theistic arguments. They are based on the intuition that some people have. This intuition is that there's an ordering force. This could not have happened by chance. So in short, studying the first Western philosophers is the most important philosophy to study, in my opinion. Doing so is not only essential to deeply understanding the sophists, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, and all other later philosophers, but it's also essential to understanding your own mind. Right? When we have identified the roots and assumptions of modern thinking, we are better situated to question the dogmas of modern thought. You're better positioned to understand why you believe there's a unity in diversity, why you might believe that the universe can make sense as the rational, orderly cosmos,